All right, let's go back. Cool. Good morning. Today we're going to talk about improving how you go about hiring. I'm not tweeting. I have my notes on my phone, so you know. Uh, I should be tweeting right now. People do that with like the photos for the audience. We'll worry about it later. Okay, we're going to be talking about how you go about improving your hiring with an emphasis on diversity, inclusivity, and consistency. This is a journey, right? We're not perfect at this yet. This conversation is not going to be perfect, but we're going to work through it together, and hopefully we'll all learn some things that we can implement in our work. So where we come from, Ellie and I, Ellie's going to be joining me for the Q&A. We don't really like those double-handed presentations where people keep swapping. We think it's confusing. So I'm going to do all the upfront talking, and then we're both going to answer the questions, but we wrote the talk together. So we are not HR professionals. We're software engineers who have led teams and organizations, and these days we consult to teams and organizations about leadership and how to improve their software practices. Terminology is hard. When I talk about underrepresented groups in technology, I'm going to say things about women or things about minorities, and sometimes I'm going to be talking about something that actually applies to both of those groups. There are obviously other groups as well. I also want to acknowledge that there are people to whom like the binary concept of gender does not apply. I'm still adjusting to using that in my everyday speech, but I'm working on it. So these are some of the things we're going to be sort of talking about today. So, which brings me to some definitions, right? Diversity is the state of having people in a group who differ along race, gender, sexuality, age, disability. Some of these are going to be protected classes, some of them are not, but often they're the things for which people experience discrimination. So inclusion is when in a diverse group, everybody feels equally included, respected, and powerful. Culture is the set of values, beliefs, shared attitudes, goals, conventions, and practices that characterize a group of people, such as your team, your company, this group here. Unconscious bias is quick and often inaccurate judgment that is based on limited facts and our own life experiences. All right? These judgments can give people unearned advantages and unearned disadvantages in your workplace. So privilege is an unearned advantage that is given by society to some but not all. And last one, oppression is the worst one, really. Systemic, pervasive inequality that is present throughout society that benefits people with more privilege and harms those who have fewer privileges. So, that's pretty full on. Why do we care? There are concepts such as equity and fairness. There are also business concepts such as profit. And there is really like the concept that if all we do is talk to people like ourselves, then we're leaving so much on the table. We're just missing out on so many opportunities to learn and improve and do better. But in business terms, there is a statistically significant relationship between diverse leadership teams and better financial performance. McKinsey has reports that tell us things like this. Racial and ethnic diversity leads to 35% better 35% better performance, and gender diversity leads to 15% better performance. It also brings you competitive advantage in terms of it's easier to win top talent, people are more interested in your company. Obviously, at the moment when people spend a lot of time talking about diversity and inclusivity, there are branding advantages to be won there. I think you should do it regardless, but sometimes these arguments are helpful. The other thing is that companies with appropriate representation of women on the board outperform companies that don't by 53%. Like, that's not like Chump change, that's not, oh, there's a couple of percentages, maybe there's a little gap there. That's 53%. And diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams, especially when solving complex problems. Now, I'm sure that somebody in the audience, at least a couple of you, just thought, but I mean, working with homogeneous teams is so much more effective. It's true, it does feel easier, but it only feels easier. So the reason for that is a thing called the fluency heuristic. Okay, I'm going to try not to get into too much psychology because one, I'm not a psychologist, but a lot of biases and the way that our brain works plays into a lot of this stuff, right? The reasons that we don't do these things innately, the reasons that we need people to give talks about it and share knowledge and learn from others about it, is because these things don't come naturally to us. The fluency heuristic is a psychological term for the bias that describes the human preference for information that is easy to process. So when you are talking to somebody who is greatly similar to you, it feels like conversation flows, it's easier, you understand each other more readily, and you think you're making progress. When outsiders are added to that group, we get what is referred to as collaborative friction, right? There are stumbling blocks, you get confused, you're not working from the same sheet of music until you actually write down what the music is and look at it together and have a conversation about it, right? So the fact is that working on diverse teams produces better results because it's harder. That's why. And there's a whole bunch more, and there's plenty of literature on this, so I'm gonna move into it. In terms of these things, then, what is the state of affairs? Like, what are the numbers? We've all seen American statistics, I'm sure. We see them in Australia, you see them here. This is one of my favorites. But what about Canada, right? So, unfortunately, very few Canadian companies publish statistics. I'm sure that surprises nobody. Very few companies in the world publish statistics. This is Google. They have, they have Canadian offices. But this is their global numbers, right? Now, companies don't post the data, and they have been asked. There's a great article where one of your local journalists asked 31 different tech companies. Only 3 of them, 2 of them had data and 1 of them was collecting it, and nobody else had any data they were willing to share at all. Most of the major companies just refused to respond to requests for information. So the people in this room are the ones who can change that though, right? You're the people who can agitate for these things to be collected, because as we're going to talk about, if you're not measuring it, you can't change it. So here are some numbers from Canada that I found. This is from Osler. I don't know how you pronounce that, but they're apparently quite a large business law firm. And this is from their diversity disclosure practices report from this year. From the same report, so more than 50% of all TSX listed boards, companies, have a written board policy on diversity for their board. And yet, almost 1/3 of all boards are still all male. Hubba, anyone here from Hubba? Damn. The only company I found who published their figures in a method that I could actually consume and pull out data and put it on the slide, rather than just respond to people in interviews. So, but this is pretty standard. This is pretty above, it's pretty across the board in the US, in Australia, in other countries that I've looked at. 1/5 of product and development positions are held by women. 25% leadership positions held by women is actually pretty good, comparatively speaking. And most people couldn't even tell you how many people in their company identified as any of these things here: gay, bisexual, asexual, or questioning. Most of them couldn't even tell you that number. So it's good that they have this, and it's a great start. I wish more companies did it. So the other thing to talk about then is the pay gap, right? It's particularly bad in Canada. Canada gets called out on global results for surveys around this. Women from visible minorities get 70% of what a man gets. They get 84.4% of what a man from a visible minority gets. And then this one's an Australian statistic because unfortunately I couldn't find a Canadian equivalent. As I said, it's very difficult to get numbers, particularly around people's sexuality and gender. Obviously these are things that it has been very difficult for people to share for years. It's getting better, but so if this many people are trying to conceal this information in your workplace, like what does that say about your workplace? What does that say about how comfortable they feel? So questions you can ask yourself based on data. This is all from the 2016 Canadian census. The way to know if you're representative on data that we do have is these questions, right? Was a quarter of your team born overseas? Because a quarter of the Canadian population was, right? Does a fifth of your team have a mother tongue that is not English or French? Because a fifth of the Canadian population does, and a mother tongue is defined as the first language you learned that you still know at the time of the census. Yeah? For those who don't know, it's the Employment Equity Act defines visible minorities as persons other than Aboriginal peoples who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in colour. This is how censuses work. So, other things you can do to ask if you're inclusive are, do you have a pay gap? What's your parental leave policy look like? Is it biased in one direction or the other? Does it make assumptions about the gender of the primary carer for the child? What about work-life balance? Is that even a thing? And do you have comfortable quilt bags? I know everybody's looking at that one. Quilt bag's a term one of our trans friends taught us that just lightens some of this stuff up a little bit. And it's queer and questioning, intersex, lesbian, transgender and two-spirit, bisexual, asexual and ally, and gay and genderqueer. So really it's just like kind of a fun way of throwing everybody into a quilt bag, apparently. So, given all of that, large amounts of context, by the way, slides will be available. We have references. You can look it all up at your leisure. Problems that we see with hiring. Diversity debt is number one. If you did not think about this when your company started, or if the people who started your company did not think about this when they started the company, you probably have this problem. So this refers to the escalating difficulty of making diverse hires if your initial staff employee base is homogenous, basically. One woman walks into a room of 10 men and goes, do I really want to be here every day? Or one person of color walks into a room of 100 white people and says, do I really want to do this every day? Those are genuine questions, and it's a genuine problem. So getting the first woman or non-binary member of your team or the first person of color to join your team, like that's the hardest, but you have to keep working on it from there. Hiring for culture fit, depending on what you read on the internet and who you talk to, this is still a thing that people are advised to do. You should not be hiring for culture fit, okay? Be hiring for culture growth. We're going to talk a bit more about that in a sec. But culture fit is often used as like a bucket for people's like feelings about somebody they just interviewed. They're like, oh, I'm not sure they're a culture fit. And that is not a useful piece of feedback. It doesn't actually explain anything. It has no detail and it can't be addressed. You can't determine whether or not it's objective or subjective. In most places, hiring is not part of the work. Now, I come to this from like an engineering point of view, like a software engineering point of view. I don't know which of you are engineers, who's product managers, who's designers, whatever, right? But I certainly know that in the companies that I have worked, it's programming, writing the code is seen as the work, and hiring is like some pain in the ass. And it astonishes me that we can think like that. I have thought like that, absolutely. That hiring somebody to sit next to me and work on my product with me for the next 5 years is something that is viewed as an afterthought, and that I try and squeeze it in spare time around my real work, right? That's a problem, we have to fix it. The other thing is that hiring is considered to be, is done ad hoc. Nicole Rufuku, who wrote Hiring for the Innovation Economy, great book, recommend you read it. It's very short, super easy. There'll be references to it later because I quote her a little bit. She talks about how she surveyed hundreds of companies about their hiring practices, and more than, I think it was 85%, don't have a hiring process. They just rely on the hiring manager to determine, the job criteria, what's going to make a good hire, do the hiring, write the job description, get the people in the door, interview them, and then determine who's the best fit and hire them. Now, it's not that hiring managers are incapable of that, right? Because we're going to talk about how we can all do that. It's that if there is no system for it, then they're not improving. There's no way of knowing what you could improve, and there's no lessons to be learned. There's no way to grow and develop this and make sure that it's as bias-free and as accommodating and inclusive as we can make it. I just referenced the language of job postings, super important. Again, it comes down to subtleties around language. Competitive terms are more appealing to men than women. That's a fact that people use. But it's true. Studies have found that, if you talk about collaborating, if you talk about teamwork, you will get more women reply post. If you talk about, hitting hard deadlines and competitiveness, then you will get more men apply. For those of you who are hiring engineers, I want to stress this point so much that it's up the top here with all the big problems. Whiteboard coding is considered harmful. If this is a practice that your organization employs, I urge you to stop it, and I'll talk more about what you can replace it with. So, before you start, all right, this is like an onion. We just keep unpeeling layers and layers and layers of things you have to do before you can hire anybody at all. Think about, what is your company like now? What is your team like now? What does it look like? What is it for you anyway, right? Maybe you're doing okay on the gender diversity front. So your next set of hires should, strive to improve in other areas. Depends. And the other thing you need to think about is, what will it be like to hire the first person who is significantly different from you? What's it going to be like for them to come here and work with you? And will it be welcoming? Will it be inclusive? Will they feel good about it? Will they be happy that they took the job? So, the first thing you can do is stop believing that your company is a meritocracy. MIT did a big study on this. Turns out that this is the number one factor. Belief that you are being meritocratic, that you are just innately meritocratic, is the number one thing that stops all of us from improving and from discriminating. The belief that we're innately just not like that, because that's not true. So you need to have a supportive environment for diversity and for beginners. Because everybody's a beginner in some context, right? You can hire a 15-year professional coder and they roll up and they've never seen the framework you're using. This is the thing. So it doesn't matter the size of your funnel of new hires. If you have a toxic environment, then the people you hire won't stick around, and they won't be talking up your company in the market, right? They'll be doing the opposite. And as per hiring is ad hoc, it turns out that 80% of companies allow their culture to just grow organically. It's understandable, but it's a mistake. So what is a healthy culture then? And again, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to go into these in great depth, but You need to have psychological safety. If people do not feel safe to come to work, if they don't feel like they're not going to be bullied, etc., then you have much larger problems than getting a new person in the door. You need to be embracing gradual and iterative improvements to your culture, to your processes. If your company doesn't expect that things will change, then you need to work on that. If your company is not accepting that there will be mistakes, then you need to work on that too. Good communication is vital. You really need to engage and be able to discuss. You need to be able to have the kind of conversations that we're going to have today, in all the sessions today. You need to be able to have those conversations with your peers, with your colleagues, with your manager, with your team. I don't like talking about work-life balance because work is part of your life. There are two, right? One of them is smaller than the other one. They are not equal on the scales. And your company needs to recognize that. And you personally, for your own health and safety, probably need to recognize that too. So, shared values are what allow you to get things done without spending too much time in meetings and without spending a bunch of time arguing about stuff. Your practices may be different, your experiences may be different, but if you share values, then you can arrive at similar destinations. And over time, the right one. So, you might think that common sense requires commonality says something backwards about diversity, but really, again, this is about communication, right? Everybody has commonalities, but unless you talk to each other, you don't know what they are, and you don't know how to find the further commonalities that allow you to communicate better. And constant learning is a key. I'm sure that's becoming clear by now as I talk about iteration and all the things, right, that you need to focus on. But if you're interested in this concept, the Harvard Business School's education department, they have a bunch of researchers there who've done work on this. There's a book called Deliberately Developmental Organizations. It's fantastic. They also have a bunch of papers. They have articles on Harvard Business Review if you just want to get a taste of some of the stuff that they've uncovered through their studies. So now we get to the hiring process itself, right? Awesome. Let's do that. Except that we're just going to do preparation first. So again, you need to diversify your inputs, right? Who are you listening to? Who are you learning from? Where are you getting your data? Try to do that from as broad a range as possible. And then as you start to get a feel for it, tighten up on the things that are relevant to your workplace, your company, the things that you need to focus on. And as I said before, you need to be able to also, as you educate yourself, you need to be able to talk to your colleagues about this and share this information internally. There's no point you going on this massive journey. You've come to this conference. Hopefully you learn something from me. You'll definitely learn something from the others. There's no point doing all of that if you don't go back and share it with your peers and the rest of your company so that they can come part of the way with you and begin to understand where you're going and the progress you're making. Another thing to consider, of course, is how your marketing stacks up, right? How many times have you looked at a company to work for and the photos on the webpage are just white men at happy hours, and you're stoked, love to work with them, maybe not. Think about these things. Go and have a look at it. Have a chat to the marketing team, have a chat to the HR team, talk about how you make the way you present the company on the website representative, but also, aspirational. If you were currently a bunch of white men who have happy hours, that's not bad. But you need to look at how to open up to other opportunities. And so, work on your marketing, work on your branding, list your values, share the things you care about. List an equal opportunity statement. Turns out that job postings that have an equal opportunity statement get replied to 10% faster than those that don't. Learn about bias. We already talked about a little bit of this, but there's more, there's always more. There are literally hundreds, thousands of biases that humans have. You can be biased about anything. You can be upset about the color of somebody's hair. Or you can treat them differently because of the color of their hair. and what they do in their free time. People totally discriminate on what other people's hobbies are. So think about, again, I mean, all my references are programming references, sorry. But think about, like people are like, oh, so do you work on products in your spare time? And they will refuse to hire somebody if they don't go home after work and then write more software. That's a flaw in your hiring process. Because we are all biased. I have biases, each of you have biases, we are all biased. That's confronting to understand for the first time. Think about it this way. It is your brain's shortcut to dealing with all the information in the world that we consume constantly all of the time. We see patterns, humans are great at pattern matching. We see patterns and we lock onto them and then we just store it back away in the brain and go, I met a black dog once and he barked at me, I don't like that kind of dog, or something, right? That is actually literally what kids do if they get like their first experience with a dog is terrible, right? They decide that all dogs are terrible. It's like a thing. So once you understand that you are biased and you begin to understand what your biases are, then you can understand how to mitigate against them. Same thing with your processes, right? Once you understand what biases are implicit in the systems that you use to hire people and the systems that you use to review their performance and, interact with them on a daily basis and everything at work and in your life, then you can start to look at how to improve them and take actions that will counteract those biases. You're not going to remove them, yeah? Assembling your hiring team. This is vital. This does not mean talk to HR. I mean, you should definitely be talking to HR, but that's not what this means. This means you go and find the people who are going to work with the person you're hiring, right? Are there product managers they're going to interact with? Are there designers, engineers, management, data analysts, subject matter experts, whatever it is in your organization? Like, you don't need, obviously, everybody they will ever work with, but you need like an appropriate and balanced subset of that, and they're your hiring team. And as I said before, it's now their job. Like, this is now your work. So you need to make sure that they're cleared from their boss to spend the time with you working on hiring this person. This sounds like a lot. I know, there's so much more. So you need to sit down with that team and you need to define what success looks like, all right? Because our default, the ad hoc methodology, suggests that what we want is the best candidate, right? That's what we all want, the best candidate. Amazing. We only hire the best people. But if you don't know what that means, if you can't define that, then how would you even know what the best is, right? So you need to determine clear job requirements. You need to literally be like, what will this person do? What skills or experience or potential do they require to meet these job requirements? Write them down. Discuss them with the other people who are going to be working with them and like, I think they do this. Are you sure? Is that what you need? Is that what we're going to have here? Is this the person who can do all of these 17 things? Or, you need to have that conversation and work it out because obviously not everybody can do everything. And you need to learn to judge on potential rather than existing knowledge. So you want to define like really the desired personality traits, right? Yes, they need some experience. Yes, they need, depends on the role, right? But what they always need is the ability to like look up documentation, to learn about the technology that is changing all the time, to learn that again, learn the new thing, learn the next new thing. Like I'm a front-end guy, just terrible, right? Just front-end frameworks all the time. You need somebody who can learn all of those things, then can communicate, then can share what they've learned, then can take ownership and have responsibility. Like those are the things you need in a hire, right? Learn to judge and score your job requirements based on those kinds of characteristics. You need to plan out your communications. You need to know what you're going to say to people. You need to have a timely methodology about this. I strongly recommend just use like templates. Like write up a couple of quick email templates, work it out. If you have a system, like if you use one of the hiring platforms, they have systems for this. I strongly recommend you learn to use those. Your intent is to set up your job candidate for the success, right? That's what you want. This is not a competitive process. It feels like one. Under the standard, like the way we often do it, it feels like one, but it's not. You're trying to find somebody that you want to work with, and they're trying to find a company that they want to work with. It is your job as the person setting up the hiring process to determine the best way, like to offer them the most support you can to show that they're a good fit, and to show, obviously, your company off in the best light so that they know you're a good fit. So communicate what the process is, explain what your expectations are, tell them what the next steps are, and do it after every interview. Like, be like, your next interview is going to be with Jill, talking about design in some such and such a context. Be accommodating to people with constraints, right? This is things like accessibility, like in the capital A sense, but it's also things like, I don't know, parents, people with other persistent health issues that aren't like classified as a disability, people who have current jobs. Somebody who works 9 to 5 at a current job in a city on the other side of the country will find it very difficult to come and spend 2 days in Toronto interviewing with you. Like, you need to learn to be accommodating of these things. Standardize your interview questions. This is huge. A structured interview consists of pre-written interview questions asked to all candidates in the same order. And you use a rubric to score them. It is the best way to fairly assess and compare candidates. It has been proven such in studies since the 1940s. We just don't do it because we're all busy thinking that hiring is like a thing that we can just do at the end of the day and get it done with, right? So here are some numbers on that, right? So in 1998, Frank Schmidt and John Hunter published a meta-analysis of 85 years of research, right? 85 years of other people's papers. They went through them all, did a meta-analysis on how well assessments predict performance. They looked at 19 different assessment techniques. And unstructured interviews, like traditional job interviews, 14% predictor of whether or not the person you hire is going to be any good at the job you're hiring them for. It's not a number anybody in management wants to hear. Like, that's terrible, right? Reference checks are 7%, and the number of years of experience they have in the same job is 3%. It's fucking irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter if they've been doing it for 15 years. They might be bad. Structured interviews, on the other hand, 26%. Second highest result you can get, the highest result being a work sample test at 29. Work sample obviously depends on what the job is, what you're doing. In engineering, it might be pairing with people, doing some actual work that you do, writing some code. In design, it might be a design problem, etc. Right? Structured interviews. What did I say? I already said all of that. Great, cool. Here's Nicole Rufuku again. They're twice as effective at predicting job performance than unstructured interviews, but they reduce bias by half. So, massive win, right? So here's some advice from Nicole's book on how to actually structure these interviews. She has an entire system, which I don't want to stand up here and like pitch Nicole's system to everybody because that's like, I haven't asked her if I can do that. but like question structure, right? Context, like give people a real life scenario for something that happened to your team as context to this question. It gives them an understanding of where your team's at, of what you face, and then you ask your question. It should be simple, it should be focused, and it should be open-ended. And then you should have prepared follow-up questions for if they have not given you enough information. Your follow-up questions should be based on what, who, how, and why. Write those questions beforehand, have them ready to use, but don't use them if you don't need to. You need to implement a rubric, devise a scoring system. 4 points is good, because then you can't like pick the one in the middle and be neutral, right? Like, strong no hire, probably no hire. I would hire them, I definitely think we should hire them. Done, easy. Implement anonymized components in the selection process. I can talk more about that, but it's like find ways that you can like anonymize them, right? Even looking at a person's name triggers selection bias. It's a true thing. students looking at writing their own name at the top of a maths test, women do worse as soon as they've written their name at the top of the test, because they have internalized the idea that women are worse at math, which is not true, by the way, but it's a bias. That's another type of thing. We'll talk about that later. Check your job posting language. I talked about this. There are ways you can do that. There's a product called Textio that does like real-time analysis, and these days this massive data set, and it's pretty great. Don't post your job unless it scores 100 on Textio. If you don't want to pay for Textio, there's a thing called JobLint. It's an open source tool. You can run it through that. It's not as advanced because nobody's paying for it, but most people pay no attention to job descriptions. You are now people who will pay attention to job descriptions because there's like, we have 2 slides for this. There's so much information about how you should do a better job of writing your job posting. There's an optimal length. Like Textio has literally hundreds of thousands of job postings now. They analyze all these things and they know how well people respond to them. I want to talk about speaking directly for a moment. Like, think about the questions that your job seeker is going to have in their head. Things like, will I learn things? Will I enjoy this culture? Do I want to work with these people? Like, will I like my day-to-day responsibilities? If you can't answer that in the job description, they're not going to apply. You then need to promote it in a variety of channels. The joy of our networked world is that we can reach a whole bunch of people. The sadness of our networked world is that most of them are just like us, because that's the people we talk to. So you need to find the networks that are not part of your regular day, right? So in my case, like hiring in Australia, I reach out to organizations that work with Indigenous people. I reach out to organizations that work with LGBTQ, quilt bags, let's just say quilt bags. Like, find those networks, form relationships with the organizers of those networks, and then, you know, ask them if they will help you reach people in their organizations. Interviews. Use a 2-person interview format, all right? We've talked about bias a bunch. We don't, we want to have 2 people in the room because one person could take a dislike, or one person could misunderstand, or one person might just be really tired today. Whatever, right? Like, they're not doing a good job of this interview. You need to have a second person in the room to help counteract that, to help balance that. Also, especially when you're doing things like, scoring and rubrics of specific questions, it can be really helpful to have one person, able to talk and communicate with the candidate while the other person's madly taking notes or writing down a score for an answer, right? By the way, you should totally warn the candidate that that's going to happen before they walk into the interview, because otherwise they're sitting there going, why are they writing so much? They're writing a lot. So, include people with diverse backgrounds in your hiring process. Seems like it should be kind of obvious, but the obvious answer is just grab your existing, grab the one visible minority engineer in your team and ask them to do every interview ever. Don't do that, right? Being the only person, the only underrepresented person, only person from an underrepresented group, in your team is already enough stress. Definitely get them involved, definitely have them as part of the interview process, for sure, but no more than anybody else. It's a tricky balance. And I strongly recommend that, 1, you create hiring cohorts, as in find 10 candidates before you start interviewing, or if you're small, whatever, 3 or 5 or whatever, right? But then ensure that they have enough diversity. If you only have one visible minority in your group of 10, they literally have 0 chance of being hired, statistically speaking. They are going to be othered by virtue of the fact that they're different to the 9 other people, right? The good news is that having only, 2 visible minorities, or 2 women of color, or whatever, having only 2 is enough to counterbalance that little thing that our heads do and makes them go, oh, that person's different, right? Is it Sesame Street? One of these kids is not like the others? Is that the one? 2 kids who are like the others and you're good. Don't use whiteboard challenges. We talked about this. Here are some options for things you can do. Consider this from a bad, terrible thing that you should never do, through to really quality ways of determining what how somebody is as an engineer. Now, I'm sure I know that other professions have similar versions of this, but whiteboard challenges really are just the worst thing ever. Don't go to the bar or the pub. There are enough coffee shops. There are enough other venues in Canada that you don't have to go to the bar. Drinking culture is a real thing. It's not for everybody, and it really just shouldn't be part of an interview process. Ask what's important for them. Ask them what they want. Make a note of it. Answer them, and then see if you can meet those needs, right? After hiring, you thought you were done. We're not done. We've hired somebody. Congratulations. Now you have to welcome them, right? What does their computer look like? What's their first day look like? Where do they meet you? What time should they be there? What should they wear? Who are they meeting with on the first day? What does their first week look like? If you can give them all of this information in advance, if you can have logins and passwords to their computers and their accounts on the first day, that'll be better than a lot of companies that I've worked at. I don't know about you, right? These are things that matter. People remember this forever. I remember the first day at every company I've ever worked at. I know exactly what it was like because you're freaking out, right? You record all of the data. Then you want to seek feedback. You want to ask the people you hired what they thought of the interview process. You want to ask the people you didn't hire what they thought. You want to ask them why they said no. And you want to provide feedback, especially to the non-hired candidates. It's a pain in the ass. I finally got to the end. I hired somebody. I'm done. But you're not. You have to reply to these other people and explain to them, say things, right? Find useful and non-legally binding ways of telling them why you didn't hire them or giving them feedback on the process. Then there's data like this, which again comes down to bias and perception and discrimination, right? So the next thing you need to do, obviously, if you want to keep these people around, is review your performance reviews, right? Now you've fixed hiring. You're done with that. You're not. You have to keep working on it. But now you also have to do this because you need these people to have a fair experience and you need your peers to have a fair experience. So in summary, conquer diversity debt by starting now's a good time. Let's do this now, right? Consciously grow your culture. Don't just hire for the status quo. Don't hire for fit. Hiring is a part of everybody's work. It is part of your job. Make time for it as part of your job. If that means that the feature gets pushed back, guess what? The feature gets pushed back because you need the team members. Hiring processes are best when they're predictable and consistent. Your job posting matters. How you assess the skills is important, right? Thank you very much. So depending on, I'm supposed to stay in the range of the camera. Depending on how much I ad-libbed, we should have some time for questions. I'm sure there are questions. This is Ellie.
Hi.
Go on, who wants to be first? I know somebody's got something. Yeah. Yeah. So how do you determine? Okay, I'm going to try and repeat it for the camera. How do you determine whether something is bias or this particular, there are characteristics that are not a good fit for your role or et cetera, right? So yeah, it's a really good point because I didn't put it on here, but absolutely part of you're writing all these things down, you're scoring all these things. Part of the process obviously needs to be periodically to review the scores, right? So if you have a hiring cohort of 10 people, look through them and see if you can determine any patterns about how you hired, how you didn't hire, who you said no to, who scored low, etc. That's probably the best way to do it, and obviously over time you develop a corpus of data around that, and that allows you to really make better judgments. Does that answer your question? Cool.
I wanted to say something else. Sorry. This is Micah. When you have, so two things. When you have questions to ask people, have a rubric for the answers. What's a good answer? What's not a good answer? And standardize that. So that removes some of the bias that you have, because you know what the answers that you want and what they are that you're expecting. To have two people in the interviews to help again. So I don't like him, but the other person does, and why? And if you have, let's say, 9 questions that all have a number assigned to them, and then you add them all up together, you get, how would you say, you get...
What, an average, a score?
You get a score in the end per each candidate that then you can use, and that reduces the bias.
Oh yeah. So it's easier to score the individual questions on like that 4-point scale, say, and then tally that up for like a score for the individual. I know these things feel uncomfortable, like we're just scoring people now, but it is actually helpful. James, you have somebody over here? Yeah, hi.
Hey, just a quick question regarding like the point about how I guess like sometimes like female colleagues may receive feedback such as like you come off as abrasive versus it not being for men.
It's not May. It's like 70%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the case where that like feedback is coming from like female peers commenting on like a female coworker, or if like that feedback's legitimate, like as a male leader, how would you like package that feedback in a way that doesn't seem like it's coming from your bias?
Okay, a couple of things to unpack there. One is that women can absolutely discriminate against women, even on gender, right? So how do you, as any kind of leader, know that the women who are complaining about this woman aren't discriminating, right? So the thing, again, it comes down to like reviewing your data, right? Like if people are consistently referring to somebody as abrasive, for example, is that feedback consistent across the board? Is that everybody's experience of this person? All right? Is it your experience of this person? And this is where we come down to like subjective versus objective, right? You really have to try and balance these things and like take notes and record and be like, okay, you know, in June, Jill said that Bob was abrasive, but nobody else has ever said that about Bob. That's cool. Bob said that Jill was abrasive, and then 3 other people said Jill was abrasive. You're like, are they all friends with Bob? Or, you know, like there are things to look at and really unpack. And like we could talk a lot about biases in the workplace. Like I have an entire other talk about culture that this is not that.
And
but
we have another talk on it this afternoon even.
Oh, well, somebody else is giving a talk on it even better.
How to be a male
right?
ally from Rhonda.
Yeah.
We have to break.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much.
So there's about 10 minutes break. So if you have more questions, feel free to
please.
them.
And we're here all 3 days. So, you know, hit us up.
There is